This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
What I propose to do today is the introduction will be in two halves. It seems to me that there's an important distinction which I have not seen discussed anywhere else, and so I wrote something on this which is something of a digression from Hegel as such, but I think it's important to try and get it under our belts, and that's the distinction between intelligence and will. I was never taught this. It was always thought that, well, it is always presumed that we know what willing is. I'm not sure that you will find in Anthony Kenny's book on Aristotle, or one of his books on Aristotle, in the beginning he says, there is no word for will in Aristotle, so I will take the following term in Aristotle to mean I will. Well, there's no word for willing in Aristotle for a very good reason. Aristotle doesn't have any concept of the will as we understand it. The concept of the will is a modern understanding, and I'm going to try and show why. Because this distinction is extremely important in what Hegel does. I'm then going to go into quite a detailed exposition of Hegel's 1805 lecture, which is translated by Leo Rauch on. So it's translated as Hegel and the Human Spirit, but it's the second and smaller section of the third Systementwürfe, or system sketch, of 1805-1806. I was really struck in reading it through, and that's the excerpt that I sent around today. I don't know anywhere else in Hegel where this is so clearly, the interconnections between these ideas are so clearly laid out. They're astonishingly clearly laid out, even though there are some provisional aspects to the fact that these are lecture notes, really, and sketches, exactly as they're entitled. In our last session, we concluded what has been an extended discussion of what lies behind the ways in which Hegel's thought proceeds. We should now, at least I hope, have a grasp on Hegel's understanding of a threefold means of proceeding, through the science of the idea as such, logic, natural philosophy, and Sittlichkeit, or ethicality, as a fundamental dialectical movement of procession and return, through which consciousness becomes self-consciousness, and through which time becomes history. I wonder if we can turn this off.
Sorry, in the threefold idea, logic was the first, what was the second?
Natural philosophy,
and ethicality.
And then the ethicality, or Sittlichkeit. As a fundamental dialectical movement of procession and return, through which consciousness becomes self-consciousness, and through which time becomes history. There is a double entendre here. Through which time becomes history means, one, the means by which subjective time becomes exteriorized as history. And in the passing of time, history realizes itself, too. These are the same as the means by which the particular constantly realizes and posits the universal. We have left unanswered a question that Hegel returns to repeatedly and points out.
Should you like to turn off that thing?
I think it's got to cool down. I've managed to, it's blinking red at me.
Would you like to unplug it there?
Well, I think if you unplug it, we might burst the glass.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I'll leave it.
I think
Sorry, Glenn.
I know you can blow these things up very easily, and I don't want to do that. So I'm hoping that it will stop worrying. We have left unanswered the question of truth as such. How are we to understand the relation to truth, success, to which Hegel refers constantly, and which he resolves both through the will and through the notion of intelligence? In what way are they already constituted as separate? To understand what is at issue here requires, I'd like to propose, a certain detour through Aristotle and Descartes. At the very inception of metaphysics, Aristotle suggests that there are two ways in which something is true. The first, he says, is what is seen for itself. And I quote, these are all my own translations, by the way, you won't find them in the standard translation. So I quote, the seeing of a particular thing is true. This is from the De Anima. Elsewhere, he speaks of this seeing as always true, anithes. And this seeing refers to thinking, noein, nous, directly, and recognizes the thing in its being true, and therefore in its essence, such that this is not some concern about how it is to be described or said. This is what Aristotle means here is, when I perceive that the door is brown, I just know the door is brown. I don't have to work it out. The door is brown. The second, however, means of truth concerns speaking of something through assertion, kataphasis, such that it is understood with respect to the true and the false. You can see here the birth of logic, and that's why we're concerned with this. Hegel's Logic doesn't have the title it has by accident. Aristotle therefore makes a distinction between what is known directly and so is self-evidently true, which can be spoken of, but in some way only after its truth is directly perceived and so known, or that's how Aristotle understands it, and what is deliberated, and so judged logically with respect to the true and false. In the appearing of whatever appears, Aristotle's characterization of how it is to be known as over against error with respect to the incorrect and the improper, these are all his words, draws attention away from the way in which whatever appears is in its manifesting, and concentrates on the thought that there is a thing which, over against the manner of its appearing, we concentrate on as what is here in and of itself. Everything in this way becomes detached from its manner of appearing. In this sense, and this is, in other words, Aristotle's positing of essences. When something appears, it makes an essence present. In this sense, we concentrate, or we have come to concentrate in the philosophical tradition on the what of the thing, its essence, its substantiality, while separating it off from the particular moment of its appearance. Such a moment that also belongs to it, what we might call its becoming, its essencing, its being. In each case, we go out after the whatness, quidditas in Latin or in medieval philosophy, wiping off from it the world within which it appears, and the one for whom it appears. Every particular begins, therefore, not as this one here, but as an indeterminate or an unlocated and atemporalized whatness, which is to be determined and worked out. When Descartes takes over Aristotle's distinctions in enforcing his own distinctions between intellect and will, it is almost as if he had Aristotle's De Anima open before him. Descartes' own taking for granted of one fundamental transition, that being is now grounded in the will, brings to light and presses to the fore one characteristic of the counterposition of error to truth, incorrectness to correctness, and the deceitful to the honest. Precisely because all of these are now grounded no longer in the understanding, intellectus, of man, but in his activity, voluntas, they function as moral categories. Hence why we're concerned with Sittlichkeit, with ethicality. If Descartes does not himself secure a whole of being on the basis of the will, thereby providing a formal description of a transformation of the meaning of being itself, neither does Aristotle secure truth as the counterpoint to error. Descartes brings to adequate description what for him is already more binding than what intellection or thinking names, namely willing, with its fundamental connection with the moral. For Descartes, there is one indubitable achievement of the will, the capacity to say to oneself, cogito, ergo sum. Now we normally translate this as I think, therefore I am. But there are two words for thinking in Descartes. Intelligere is one verb to think, and cogitare, which is better translated as to deliberate, but it can mean to act. Descartes states at the very opening of his Principles of Philosophy that, and I quote, "It is necessary for the one seeking the truth once in his life, insofar as he is able, to doubt all things." You'll be familiar with this. This I should have this kind of familiar stuff to anybody who's dabbled in philosophy. Adding, and I quote again, "Indeed, the doubtful should be considered false." From the very outset, therefore, Descartes takes up a position which is not world-indicating, but rather world-denying or world-effacing, in order that we are able to establish what it is, he says, most certain and easy to know for us. What is most certain and easy to know, however, even while supposing, and I quote again, that there be no God and that there are no bodies, and even that we ourselves are not to have, indeed, any body at all, is the cognition that, and I quote, "Ego cogito, ergo sum," of all things the first and most certain. Cogito ergo sum, as I've already said, is normally translated as I think, therefore I am. But Descartes himself gives a much wider and more careful definition of what is meant by cognition, cognitio, and so by the verb cogitare. Descartes says, cogitare means not only thinking, willing, and to be imagining, but at the same time sensing. And this is a very literal translation of his Latin. Acquaita non modo intelligere vere imaginari, sed etiam sentire idem est hic quod cogitare. Imaginari is a passive infinitive, not an active infinitive. It doesn't mean to imagine, it means to be imagining. And he uses the passive infinitive all the way through the Principles. And it's not deponent. Those of you familiar with Latin grammar will know that a deponent verb, we are normally taught in school, is a passive verb with an active meaning. That is actually rubbish. But it's complicated. It's why it's rubbish, it's complicated. It's easier to teach school children that deponent verbs are passive verbs with active meanings than to explain what's really going on. And that's why schoolmasters do it. And then everybody forgets that they really are passive verbs. And when you say, hang on a minute, but if you look at what's going on here, doesn't this pertain? Then people get very cross and say, no, it's deponent. We've thought that for hundreds of years. Go away, stop thinking. If you were a Latin speaker, a native Latin speaker, you heard deponent verbs in the manner that you were supposed to hear them, because you'd never read an English grammar book. At this point of the text, the distinction that Descartes appears to draw attention to is that between the interior and the exterior world. We've come across this repeatedly in Hegel. The so-called, what comes to be thought of in Descartes, but not in Hegel, as the mind-body distinction. And Descartes is interested in showing that all sensing, and he speaks of knowing, for instance, that is a walking or seeing, to show that all sensing is concerned with the outside world, and is also, therefore, involved in cogitation. Cogitation, therefore, refers to the whole range of human being, so that it is a kind of active deliberation, a doing, a moving, as much as a thinking. What this means is that, quite to the contrary of the way in which Descartes has usually been interpreted, the positing of the one thing of which I may be most certain and secure, cogito sum, is not accomplished on the basis of a distinction between the world out there and the self in here, but rather that even what is out there, the range of activities covered by sensing, must also be secured by as certain a means as everything that can be certainly known in here and through, and I quote, thinking, willing, and to be imagining. This is an important point to make, because the mind-body distinction, as it's discussed, certainly as I was taught Descartes, is a fiction. You won't really find it in Descartes. It's a way, again, that we have taught ourselves to interpret Descartes. You can find something which will support an argument for a mind-body distinction in Descartes. You will not find a formal mind-body distinction in Descartes, even though he describes the human being as res cogitans, as a cogitating thing. But if you've already decided that all cogitating is only to do with the mind, then you'll automatically find a mind-body distinction. That's the problem. This one thing is the cogito sum is in every case to be secured in advance, and so for Descartes, mathematically, in advance of everything else that is known. It is the secure basis on which every known thing will be made to stand. The idea in advance of every other idea is ego cogito ergo sum. We find Kant makes the same point. Because this value is known, it's certain. The word that Descartes uses consistently is certe. It certifies everything else that is knowable insofar as it is actually knowable. It is what is most known in every known thing. It is often supposed that Descartes achieves the cogito ergo sum on the basis of a dualism between mind and body, hence why cogito is so often translated as merely I think, which would actually be intelligo, the verb Descartes also uses constantly. Descartes is seeking a far more basic distinction in the range of cogitative deliberation, one which allows him to demonstrate a description of the being of being human that is more fundamental than anything like his supposed dualism between mind and body, which, it is clear, is for him at least not a fundamental distinction in cogitative deliberation. To accomplish this distinction, Descartes argues that, and I quote, indeed, all the modes of deliberative cognition which we experience within ourselves can be brought under two general headings. One is perception, percipio, or the operation of the intellect. Truly, the other is volition, or the operation of the will. This distinction I propose is so fundamental to Descartes that it does not distinguish between thinking and doing the activity of the body, but intends actually to subsume thinking under itself. It's not a distinction anymore. It's a taxis, it's an order, setting of things in priority. So that willing is prior to and greater than thinking, and also what makes thinking possible. In this distinction between intellect and will, Descartes says, and I quote, sensing, to be imagining, imaginari, and bare understanding are merely the diverse modes of perception. Nam sentire, imaginari, et pure intelligere sunt tantum diversi modi percipiendi. On the contrary, however, and I quote, desiring, being averse, affirming, negating, doubting are the diverse modes of willing. Cupere, avversari, affirmare, negare, dubitare sunt diversi modi volendi. The more fundamental distinction in this list is not therefore between sensing and all the rest, the so-called mind-body dualism, but between willing and mere perception, intellectus. It is this all too rarely noticed distinction which is the most determinatively grounding for Descartes. The realm of intellection is already certain, he says. That's the same as in Aristotle, in other words. When I know something, the door is shut. I just know it. I don't have to deliberate it. It's just there. The realm of the will, for finite humanity, for Descartes at least, is always ordinarily dubitable. If Descartes can show that the subject also experiences in the realm of the will even one certainty that ought otherwise to belong to the realm of mere perception, he will have elevated something contained in the otherwise dubitable will to the same degree of knowing of the certain will of God. This is what he's out to do. He wants to show. He says that the will is the most untrustworthy part of the human soul. The only one who has a perfect will is God. Whatever God wills is true. Therefore, God cannot God cannot will error. And therefore everything that God knows, either as a perception or through God's will, is true. For humanity, this is not the case. The will is, he says, constantly erring. So he's out to find one willed truth which cannot be doubted. Cogito sum.
Is there a real, I mean, if we're talking about God, is there a real distinction between will and perception? I mean, it would appear that...
Well, that's a good question. I mean, it's a major medieval debate. Is there a real distinction? The answer, in terms of the true, the answer would be no. But there is a distinction between God's will and what God knows. Now, I mean, Aquinas resolves it by making God's act a single act, so that God only wills everything once. The big problem in medieval philosophy is whether God can change his mind. And so the extreme voluntarists want to say, if God decided tomorrow morning that 1 and 1 could equal 5, then he would. Because we believe in God, we don't believe in 5. Descartes is dealing with the very end of the problem of that. Now, Aquinas solves this by saying, well, there's only one act in God. So therefore, God could change God's mind, but in order to change God's mind, it would have had to, the change of mind would have had to have been part of the single act that God is. It's crafty. The realm of the will for finite humanity is always ordinarily dubitable. If Descartes can show that the subject already also experiences in the realm of the will even one certainty that ought to otherwise to belong to the realm of perception, he will have elevated something contained in the otherwise dubitable will to the same degree of knowing of the certain will of God. We see immediately how the accompanying, for instance, in Kant, the accompanying of everything known by the I think as cogito transforms the question of what is true. This is why for Hegel, the truth of speculation is grounded not in the intellect, which is merely reflection, but in freedom of the will. This is why Hegel is so concerned with not reflection, but self-reflection. He is, as it were, sorting out problems that are left over from Kant and from Descartes, and ultimately resolving a distinction, and in fact coming back to what he was suggesting by putting absolute subjectivity in the place of God. That's what's really going on. Perception, from Descartes' use of the Latin percipio, covers the trio intellection to be imaginative and sensing. In each case, what is referred to is something not that the self does, but rather that befalls the self in perception. In perception, stuff we just come across it. It befalls us. Or that the self comes up against by virtue of something that happens to it. Perception is therefore a primarily passive faculty that involves a taking in of the already extant. The door is already there. When I turn my attention to it, I discover that it's true that it's closed. Hence why Latin percipio can even mean the act of eating. It's a taking in. Per capio, literally taking into the box or the head. Such that I am determined by what I take in. It is for this reason that the word usually translated as imagining is consistently given in Descartes' Latin as a past infinitive, as I've said, imaginari. And why I've translated it not as imagining with its productive modern sense, but with the passive aspect emphasized. This is in order to preserve the sense of something which is exactly in this instance and precisely for Descartes involuntary, and so not involving the voluntas or will. Percipio means originally to take to oneself, and so to take in and assimilate. Descartes' subsumption of intellection, sensing, and the involuntary occurring to oneself of the imaginary discloses in each case that perceptions are without volition or choice, and so they could not be other than that they are, exactly as Aristotle said. As involuntary, and so as not able to be other than what they are both restricted and at the same time true for themselves. This is Descartes' problem. They're restricted in some way. They're quite finite, and he's not interested in finite knowledge. Descartes notes that, and I quote, all which we clearly perceive is true. These are his clear and distinct ideas. And especially he refers this to mathematical truths, and I quote, no longer need mathematical truths be suspect to us since they are the most clear. End of quote. They always have a proof attached to them. The mathematical, in fact, they resolve into tautologies. The mathematical, like every other genuine perception, befalls us and so overpowers us. Only through the exercise of the will can we exercise any power of resistance to that which merely befalls us, and so can truth thereby be located in the domain not of mere perception, but of freedom itself. In mathematics, as a form of truth, there is no choice, no freedom, only the necessary pertains, and so the will is, strictly speaking, absent. At the beginning of the treatise, Descartes makes an unusual remark, one which would seem to cast doubt on the method of doubt itself. For he says in the third paragraph of the Principles, this capacity for doubting should meanwhile not be applied to everyday life. It's again something that's not often noticed. It now becomes possible to see what is at issue. For everyday life is concerned with what befalls us, and so what is ordinarily true in perception. What Descartes is particularly concerned with is, and I quote, meanwhile this dubitability needs to be restricted solely to the contemplation of truth. Dubitability is not really concerned with matters of everyday life, but only with the highest and most prior things, what is always first in the order of knowing. Why is this distinction between willing and perception so important? In the first place, the modes of willing are all modes of judgment, but not only of judgment concerning things, but also concerning speaking about things, or rather we articulate the judgment through the speaking about them. To affirm and to negate correspond exactly to Aristotle's distinction between apophasis and affirmation, and kataphasis, negation, in the saying of the true and the false. Descartes has, I may have got that the wrong way around, my head's not been in Greek much recently. Descartes has therefore firmly located the truth of the method of doubt. And so the grounding of the statement cogito ergo sum is grounded not in the intellect, but in the will. The statement cogito ergo sum is a self-evidence. Not only is it not therefore the conclusion of a syllogism as it's sometimes presented, or the conclusion of an argument, it couldn't possibly be that. It is self-evidently true. It requires no prior argument. And it's sometimes misunderstood that the ergo is in reference to a prior premise. It's not. Cogito ergo sum is just true because it's true. Not only is it the saying of something which is in each case true, insofar as there is one saying it for him or herself, but it is the saying of what cannot not be true. This is the really important point. If you say this, it cannot not be true. It's binding, you're stuck with it. You cannot get around it. As a kataphasis, an affirmation, I did go around it. It is at the same time a negative apophasis, a demonstrative statement of what could not be other than it is. However, as a thing that cannot not be true, it is also not a perception, remembering that perceptions are also always true insofar as they are clear and distinct. But rather, cogito ergo sum is a statement that arises as a judgment on the basis of the will. It is alone what we both will insofar as we know it, and insofar as we know it to be intuitively true. In his treatise, De Interpretatione, or Concerning Interpretation, Aristotle immediately follows the definition of apophatic and kataphatic speech with the claim that everything that can be affirmed can also be denied, and vice versa. Descartes is concerned, however, to demonstrate that there is at least one kataphatic demonstration which cannot be denied, and cannot be said as other than it is, and that is namely cogito ergo sum. At the same time, this absolutely true and irrefutable statement is referred formally not to the matters of everyday life, nor as a perception, but as an active, cogitative deliberation. As all of this, it is at the same time not a perception which could ordinarily be true, but is an attainment of the will, where the method of doubt, dubitability as such, really matters. Every accurate perception is a matter for the intellect. What intelligo, I know, is at the same time a true perception. Strictly speaking, accurate perceptions are both clear and cannot be other. They involve no deliberation. Descartes adds, and I quote, "Ours is not to err, except when we judge some matter we do not fully perceive." If the intellect is always involved, it nevertheless is not always involved in terms of truth alone. There are matters which remain obscure to it, and about which it therefore makes no judgment of the true. There are, however, those matters which are simply true to the intellect through pure perception. And I quote, "Moreover, the perception of the intellect does extend beyond it, Moreover, the perception of the intellect does not extend itself except to those few things which are offered to it, and it is always strongly finite. The will may truly in some way be called infinite, for we find without exception that its object can be concerned with things pertaining to other worlds, even those of the immense will which is in God, to which indeed ours does not extend itself." So therefore I've shown what's going on for Descartes in this distinction between what is simply known, and that's not really what he's worried about in the method of doubt, and then what can be willed and what can't. There is one cogitation which cannot be other than it is. It is from this background that I want to return to the lectures of the Jenaer period, Hegel's Jenaer period. Although in the next session we will look closely at the Rechts philosophy, the Jenaer texts show much more directly the connection between Hegel's understanding of perception and how, through the productive activity of the will, he relates the coming to be of subjectivity to absolute subjectivity, eventually as it will be realized in the state. Hegel's Jenaer lectures were first published under the title of Jenaer Philosophie, volumes 1 and 2 in 1931 by Johannes Hofmeister. In the years between 1971 and 76, the Rhine-Westphalian Academy of Sciences released a critical edition in a new series of Hegel's texts. And these were re-released in the 1980s in modernized German paperback editions, which also cover the Jenaer period. There are important editorial and interpretative differences between the editions of the 1930s and the 1970s. Leo Rauch, commenting on the difference between the editions of 1931 and 1976, and his impression of the manuscripts, he obviously got to see Hegel's own manuscripts, notes that, and I quote, "A look at the actual manuscripts shows how tenuous all this is." In other words, the manuscripts, I've not seen the manuscripts myself, but they're quite difficult to interpret, and that's certainly the impression you get from both sets of texts. Both the lectures are in the Jenaer Philosophy of 1803-4 and of 1805-6 are essentially notes, collections of notes. Once again, we are brought up against how a text comes into being and how it is actually to be understood. At the same time, our extended excursus into Hegel's fundamental metaphysical position ought to enable us to understand how to carry out a thoroughgoing interpretation of the notes that Hegel has left behind. Here I should say that I'm not simply interested in a philology of Hegel's work or Hegel's development, nor a comparative history of his texts. There are scholars who love to do this kind of stuff. That's not what I'm after. I'm after what he's thinking about. Hegel's fundamental understanding, and more importantly, what he is responding to, is in place, I would argue, by the time of his book on Schelling's and Fichte's systems of 1801, in other words, the beginning of the Jenaer period. Hegel lays out the condition for the whole of his thinking negatively in relation to Fichte, Kant, and Spinoza, right at the beginning of his published works, in fact in the difference text that we looked at so closely in the last session. He argues that the principle of Fichte's system is that the same transcendental principle at the basis of Kant's deduction of the categories is das reine Denken seiner selbst, die Identität des Subjekts und des Objekts in der Form Ich equals Ich. I can't remember what equals is in German. Ich egal. Ich. The pure thinking of the self, the identity of subject and object in the form of I equals I. It's often written as ego equals ego. I'm uncomfortable with this. You know, the English interpretation of Freud would have hugely benefited by not Latinizing terms. I don't know how you were taught Freud as an undergraduate, but everyone in Britain was taught the distinction between the ego, the id, and the superego. They work totally differently if you know that Freud wrote this as the Ich, the Über-Ich, and I can't remember what the id is, but it's the id as...
S.
What?
S.
S, yeah. So that these mysterious Latin terms would have been much more intelligible. Here, this thinking takes the form of the subjective I thinking itself, and so being enacted as object to and for itself. Hence how speculation as such posits itself through the natural. So the whole point of the dialectical method is to connect Geist and the natural, to show what the connection is and how the connection unfolds. What is the condition of thinking that Hegel understands neither Spinoza nor Fichte nor Kant to have attained to in their thinking? The question is that of the object. What is it that is thought in the object? Is it the self? This is what Hegel understands Spinoza, Fichte and Kant all to think. Hence his criticism that theirs is merely, he says, ein subjektives Subjekt-Objekt, a subjective subject-object. Hegel's argument is that such an object will always be conditioned by pure consciousness. That is to say, it will be merely what is willed to be by the subjectivity of the subject. It has, strictly speaking, nothing out of which it is aimed, except itself in its pure possibility. In other words, if the object that the subject becomes to be to itself turns out to be nothing but a reflection of its subjectivity, it's not a genuine object. It hasn't genuinely attained to exteriority. He describes this as das reine Bewusstsein selbst, die Form eines Bedingten durch eine objektive Unendlichkeit, den Zeitprogress in Infinitum, in dem die transzendentale Anschauung sich verliert und ich nicht zur absoluten Selbstanschauung sich konstituiert verwandelt. The pure consciousness changes itself into the form of a thing conditioned through an objective infinity, the progress of time ad infinitum, in which the transcendental manifesting, translating Anschauung as manifesting, loses itself, and the I does not constitute itself from out of an absolute self-manifesting. I've translated Anschauung here as manifesting, since intuition, which is the normal English translation, suggests something purely conceptual, when what is precisely at issue is the relation of what we might call the actual, the present or the real, to the subjectively manifest. In other words, it's not about what goes on in your head. It's an intuition in here, as it were. Because the I is not conditioned through the absolute, in exactly the way we saw in the last session, the I has to condition itself. It can only do this for itself through the ought, rather than the actual, the is of the absolute. This is Hegel's critique of Fichte. Here we see a fundamental difference between Hegel and Nietzsche. For in both, the absolute and the will to power, nature, or rather being itself, appears as something willed. But for Nietzsche, the absolute does not decide in advance, but leaves open how the individual will corresponds to the already willed of the will to power. It is this that formally transforms Nietzsche's philosophy into a psychology, and transforms the moral imperatives that are presented by Fichte and Kant into what is for Nietzsche the absolute drive and imperative to become of the subjectivity of the subject. So Nietzsche is picking up a question that Hegel needs, as it were, open or results in a different way. Hegel therefore lays down the fundamental condition of speculative philosophy, of all dialectical reason as such, but he does so negatively. Speculation is not determined from out of the absolute. He says, übergibt die Vernunft den Verstand und geht in die Kette der Endlichkeiten des Bewusstseins über, als welchen sie sich zur Identität und zur wahren Unendlichkeit nicht wieder rekonstruiert. So that speculation not determined from out of the absolute hands reason over to intellection and passes over into the chain of finite things from which it never reconstructs itself again as the identity of the true infinity. Therefore, we can see that speculation, the negativity of dialectical reason, is therefore the constant reconstruction of the originary identical absolute from out of everything finite. If you want a definition of speculative philosophy, there it is. The constant reconstruction of the originary identical absolute from out of everything finite. Let's find that 1801. All that is finite is in a chain, Kette. This chain is not merely a horizontal interconnection, it leads up from finitude to the truly infinite. Every finite thing, every deed and object stands in this chain, within which we must not lose ourselves, but always remain fixed on the meaning of, as that which through sublation points us up to, the absolutely, infinitely true. How is this chain manifest? In the shorter of the sketches or lecture notes of 1803-4, Hegel lays out, 1805-6, Hegel lays out the chain of finite entities with great precision, in a way arguably much clearer than we will find in the later Rechts philosophy. The absolute is present from the outset, since the absolute is being itself. Whereas space is essentially divided from its content and is therefore only a formal universal, being, he says, is a true universal, since it contains the particular itself. The thing is, it is not in being. The being, Wesen of Anschauung, intuition, manifesting, is, he says, Wissen eines Seienden, knowing of a being. Hegel posits Geist as a both self-positing and a freedom. And he starts with the idea of the animal, which distances itself from the immediacy of the universal of being into the mediation of time and space. But at the same time, that this positing, this self-positing, is its own overcoming. All of this, he says, is time, which is for itself, thus different from the formal intuition or Anschauung of time, the time of but it is rather the time of mediated self-positing. Dies reine Subjekt, das frei ist von seinem Inhalt, aber auch über diesen her, wie Raum und Zeit nicht sind, die das Selbstlose sind. This pure subject, which is free of its content, but is lord over it, as space and time are not, since they are selfless. The self is a constant self-abstraction from space and time. Geist begins from this genuine universal and then negates it as a positing of it within itself, as something, he says, anschauend überhaupt, generally manifesting. As this, Geist is the representational power of imagination in general, vorstellende Einbildungskraft überhaupt. It's a difficult beginning, the beginning of these sketches. It's difficult. You know, he's trying to get from pure absolute to perception, which he begins as something animal, tierish, he says, and then he's going to move on to how we move beyond. The human being moves beyond being merely tierish, animal. Hegel proceeds to analyze the meaning of Anschauung as a manifesting that is at the same time a showing forth and so a looking, such that aus diesem Anschauen tritt der Geist heraus und schaut sein Anschauen an. You should hear all the playing with words that's going on here. From this manifesting, Geist steps forth, tritt auf, and makes manifest its manifesting, or looks upon its onlooking. What this means is that Geist appears at the moment that the making manifest of a thing returns to itself, And I become able to bring to the fore, not that I am making some object manifest before myself, but that I know myself knowing the object. I look on my own onlooking. The consequence is that Geist is the pure image built of onlooking, the contemplation of self-conspection, which is a negation, an abstracting from what stands over against it. Geist is negation, but Hegel also uses the image of the night as such. He says in a way that's quite strange in the beginning of this lecture, Der Mensch ist diese Nacht. Humanity or man is this night. Hegel uses the same understanding of the power of imagination, the power to dismember and recombine images, that Kant employs in the third critique, when Kant says, die Einbildungskraft ist nämlich sehr mächtig in Schaffung gleichsam einer anderen Natur aus dem Stoffe, den ihr die wirkliche gibt. Wir bilden auch wohl The power of imagination is therefore very powerful in creating another nature out of the stuff which actual nature gives it. We also even remodel actual nature. Hegel calls the arbitrariness of this power of imagination an empty freedom, die leere Freiheit. Hegel then proceeds to spend some time discussing the self-positing of the self through naming and uncovering itself as object to itself. However, we are already aware, as Hegel assures us all over again, that the I, either as subject or as object, and thus merely as subjective object to itself, either in its mere knowing or mere willing, is insufficient as a ground as such, that is to say, as a way of grounding the universal. In the self-positing of the self, even in the positing of the self through naming and speaking, we have not moved beyond intellection to will. And so, Hegel says, he begins, das wollende Will, das heißt, es will sich setzen, sich als sich zum Gegenstand machen. That which is willing wills, i.e. it wants to posit itself, to make itself as itself, its own object. Hier als, es ist frei, aber diese Freiheit ist das leere, formale, schlechte. It is free, but this freedom is the empty, formal, bad. The will is a being for itself, which has extinguished from itself everything alien, and yet it is otherless, contentless, and it feels this lack. Hegel says that das Gefühl des Mangels ist die alpha oben gesetzte Einheit beider Intriebe als Gefühl, als Mangel des Gegensatzes. The feeling of the lack is the earlier mentioned, i.e. alpha, posited unity of both in the drive, as feeling, as lack of the counterposition, lack of what stands before it. The universal and the particular are locked up together in the drive, Trieb. Hegel explicitly distinguishes between this drive to accomplish the unity of the particular and the universal from desire, die Begierde, which we've met before. Dies ist tierisch, he says. This is animal, Begierde. Drive is something which is proper to humanity. And he then proceeds, this is the opposite of the way we would resolve it, I think, in modern philosophy. And he proceeds then to inquire into the meaning of the tool as that through which labour is achieved. Here the work of the I, labour, or work, is defined as activity, knowing itself as activity. You can see that we move from an interior perception to a going out beyond ourselves, Tätigkeit, an activity, a doing, which nevertheless is analogous to the way that we knew what we knew. Thus he says that der befriedigte Trieb ist die aufgehobene Arbeit des Ich. The satisfied drive is the sublated work of the I. Here the objective and subjective genitives must be heard. The work in question is both what the I does and what gives the I to be, what makes it what it is. The will invested in the work of the I is an artfulness. Rauch uses the translation cunning. The word in German is List. And through this artfulness, the will has become feminine. Der Willen ist ein gedoppelter, ein zweiter geworden. The will has become something doubled in a bifurcated manner. The will has thereby become doubled, split in two. But this is inadequate. The will is still one, but functioning doubly. It is included into itself doubles through its work, through the work of the I, and through its list, its artfulness. In this doubledness, each of the forks of which takes on a character, Hegel adds, der eine Charakter ist diese Spannung, die Macht der Entgegensetzung, the Sein, the other blind is. The one character is this tension, the power of the confrontation of beings, which, however, is blind. The other, however, is blind. In a marginal note, Hegel explicitly distinguishes between male and feminine in this division up into characters. Der Mann hat Begierde, Trieb. Der weibliche Trieb ist dies, vielmehr nur Gegenstand des Triebes zu sein, zu reizen, Trieb zu erwecken und ihn sich an ihm befriedigen zu lassen. The man has desire, drive. The feminine drive is this, far more to be only object of the drive, to excite, to arouse, and to allow it to satisfy itself in it. Hegel gives precise descriptions of the twofold nature of character itself that emerges from this. One character universal, the other particular. One blind, open, driving, straightforward, the other evil, shut up in itself. Yet each comes to know itself in the other, and in this self-knowing renounces itself before the other. This renunciation again, we've come across before. This is the Ablassen of the renunciation of the will. Hegel concludes at this point that this is Liebe, love. He adds, das Wissen ist eben dieser Doppelsinn. Jedes ist darin dem anderen gleich, worin es sich ihm entgegengesetzt hat. Knowledge itself is precisely this double sense. Each is the same to the other, in that wherein it has opposed itself, i.e. to the other. This he calls not just knowledge, Wissen, but cognition, Erkennen. You now see why the earlier discussion about Descartes was so important. Concluding, dies Erkennen ist die Liebe. This cognition is love itself. This Hegel contrasts to friendship. Freundschaft ist allein im gemeinschaftlichen Werke und fällt in die Periode des Werdens des sittlichen Wesens. Friendship is only to be found in communal work and falls into the period of the emergence of ethical being. From love, Hegel moves swiftly into the feminine, swiftly but dialectically. In being satisfied, movement enters into love, and the two poles of the doublement and opposition are unified as satisfied love. The two, the male and the female, in other words, become a single thing. Drive is satisfied in the consequent unity of satisfied love, such that in it emerges das Dritte, das Erzeugte, the third, the engendered. The two poles of the love relationship are not two separate entities or objects, precisely being in intense opposition, Spannung. They remain both in unity and distinguished from each other. Their ongoing relationship is satisfied through a mutuality and mutual service, which produces and continues to produce the third, the child. Es ist Mittel und Mittel der Liebe. It is mean and means of love. This is Rach's translation. A marginal remark on the text notes, Entzweierung der Liebe in die seinen Extreme, deren Mitte ihnen als ein abstraktes Sein gegenübertritt, worin jede seiner Liebe vorstellig macht für das andere, sich zum Anderssein, zum Dinge, Arbeit für das andere ebenso bleibende Befriedigung der Begierde. Das Ding erhielt die Bedeutung der Liebe. Dividing the love in the existing extremes, whose mean emerges as an abstract being over against them, wherein each makes love representative for the other, itself a being other, a thing, Work for the other is likewise an ongoing satisfaction of desire. The thing preserves the significance of the love. The child, therefore, is the preservation of the significance of the love between the parents. Having dismissed desire as animal, Hegel now proceeds to speak only of the satisfaction of desire in the interior life of the family. This dividedness of the object producing another object, and the communality of labour or work required for the satisfaction of desires here is other than the drive, which was before purely interior, purely rational. Desire, therefore, as Hegel discusses it here, it's odd how Hegel moves. Having said Begierde is merely animal, he then moves us into a discussion of Trieb, desire. He then goes back to using this term, Begierde. Desire, therefore, must relate to the exteriority, the relations between objects, rather than, as drive manifested itself, relations between subjects, who, as doubled, are in a sense a single exteriority or single object. Hegel notes that die Arbeit geschieht nicht für die Begierde als Einzelne, sondern allgemeine. The work does not occur for the individual's desire, but as general or as universal. It supports all concerned. Hegel draws attention to two other matters in this question of the production of the family and the work required to sustain its production. In the first place, this labour produces family property, that is to say, a stock of possession, not merely work for a purpose. Secondly, the production of the child is not merely in the sexual act and in the fact of birth, but also in its education, Erziehung, which is bewusste Bewegung das Werden seines Für-sich-Seins, conscious movement of the becoming of its being for itself or himself. Hegel concludes this discussion by saying, die Familie ist beschlossen in diesen Momenten, Alpha der Liebe als natürliche Erzeugung von Kindern, Beta die selbstbewusste Liebe, bewusste Empfindung und Gesinnung und Sprache derselben, Gamma die gemeinsame Arbeit und der Erwerb, gegenseitige Dienstleistung und Sorge, Delta die Erziehung. Kein Einzelnes kann zum ganzen Zweck gemacht werden. The family is encapsulated in these moments. A. Love itself as natural begetting of children. B. The self-conscious love, conscious feeling and sentiment and language of the same. Gamma, or C. Shared labour and acquisition, reciprocal service and care. D. Education itself. None of these on their own, or none singly, can become the entire purpose, i.e. of the family. Hegel returns after this to the fictitious question of the state of nature, which he's discussed extensively, we saw in the first session, the state of nature, so common in Rousseau, in a recapitulation of this first part of the development of the argument. What is it that initiates the departure from the so-called state of nature? That is, from what he calls an undifferentiated state of das freie, gleichgültige Sein von Individuen gegeneinander, the free, indifferent being of individuals over against one another. He understands the fundamental relation on which he begins to construct the production of the self, its self-recognition, and then its self-reproduction, to be the realization of that which is already present, already here to be realized. He begins by speaking of the process from the self and its return as recognition. The moment of recognition is the movement of recognized being, anerkanntes Sein. He proceeds, der Mensch wird notwendig anerkannt und ist notwendig anerkennend. Aus Anerkennen ist selbst die Bewegung. Und diese Bewegung hebt eben seinen Naturzustand auf. Man himself is necessarily to be recognized, and is necessarily recognizing. As recognizing, he is himself the moving, and this moving sublates his natural situation. We're not once again able to investigate the origin of the movement in question, because Hegel gives us no help here. Hegel makes no other claim for this movement, that the man himself is this movement. In his investigation of recognition, Hegel then posits love as the primary relation of recognition. It is easy to see how for Hegel love fulfills this role when man recognizes woman and marries her. It's very much that structure, by the way. Man goes out, finds a woman and marries her. It's extremely patriarchal in its structure. The very gendered structure of this argument, however, presents Hegel with a problem, and that is of men recognizing other men. Hegel doesn't even touch on the question of women recognizing each other. It seems they don't. He posits as the natural indifference of the state of nature a relation of anger and conflict. However, this too is only a means to ground recognition outside the relations of heterosexual love, the family, and therefore to ground the recognition of civil society and ultimately the state. The relation of antagonism posits, he says, the question of death as that inevitable consequence of unrestrained antagonism. Antagonism means, dass dies auf den Tod eines anderes geht, that it must resolve itself in the death of another. But this is really the pursuit, he says, of a Selbstmord, a suicide. When I realize that the only way I can resolve my anger is to kill somebody else, I realize that this is, in fact, a kind of suicide. This coming up against the death of the male other brings the male other up against das andere als reine Selbst, the other as pure self, which is ein Wissen des Willens, a knowledge of the will, or knowledge of willing itself, in precisely the way that antagonism and the death of the other unveil the pure unitary self, which Hegel will later call absolute subjectivity. The knowledge of the will reveals the will not as particular in the drive to overcome the other, but dieser wissende Willen ist nun allgemeiner. This knowing willing is now universal. As universal, it is precisely not absolute drive, but its opposite, triebloser Willen, driveless willing. The knowing will ist das Sein, Wirklichkeit überhaupt, und der Einzelne, das Subjekt, ist die Person, is being itself, reality in general, and the individual, the subject, is the person. When we uncover this, driveless willing as universal, we uncover, he says, der Willen des Einzelnen ist der Allgemeine, und der Allgemeine ist der Einzelne. Sittlichkeit überhaupt, unmittelbar aber Recht. The willing of the individual is the universal, and the universal is the individual. Ethicality in general, immediately, however, right or law. It is difficult not to conclude that with the ending of this first section of these lectures of 1805, that we've uncovered what is in fact a form of the will to power, the origin and departing point immediately for a Rechts philosophy. I'm going to leave it there. I have to disappear and move my car because I'm on a meeting.
Ich gleich nicht, wissen Sie unser
Ich gleich. Gleicht. Thank you. I'll be back in. So, shall we reconvene in a quarter to?
Would you mind happening to the proceedings of the afternoon?
Yeah, no, you can't go. They're right to leave. Laurence, do you want me to get you tea?
That would be fantastic. Possible to send them. Yes, thank you very much. Thanks for sending the others.
Sorry? We're going to have coffee or...
Oh, I've got to lecture now. I'm going to go. Well, potentially.
Oh, yes, we're going to get one.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
He's a busy boy,
But I tell you what we're doing there ties nicely with this.
which was Benjamin.
Yes, he's criticizing, well, he's reading a long article, reading elective affinities of God, which deals with the family and all this.
You going to come and get something to drink? Will you?
Yes, I'm very much.
Come, let's go. I'm going to move fast here. So I'll see you.
Yeah, see you tomorrow.
Do you want to meet me for coffee at Blackwood?
If I can make it, yes.
Well, phone me.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in the morning. Yeah. Bye. Nice to see you.
Well, you see
I'll see you Friday.
Yes, you see me. Yes,
For the,
okay.
okay.
Thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Thank you. Excuse me eating, but I didn't have lunch. This is a naughty lunch.
So that's a good one.
Oh, you should have lunch. It's good for you. Do you normally eat lunch?
No, I wasn't hungry.
Yeah. I think, are we all back? Yeah, keep going. So the section that I proposed for reading. Yeah. The section I suggested for reading was from Der Geist and the Geist in its concept. The section that's the section I've just given a summary of. The section that we're to look at is from Wirklich der Geist. So do you want to give us just some impressions?
Yeah, sure. So I apologise in advance if I make some glaring mistakes. I'm sort of going on what I've perceived from the text. So it's what I can gather, the section, this passage is concerning property and exchange. To get past this Fichtean problem of the subject's inability to know the object because it is itself the subject, Hegel introduces, rather than having another object, he actually introduces another subject. By this, we are able to see the identity in non-identity. So we begin, so he talks initially about labour, the labour of the subject being just in itself abstract. The only way of making it concrete is through labour which would be labour which is done by everyone for everyone. So until we're able to introduce another subject in relation to the active subject, we can't actually have, we can't make concrete we can't make concrete the labour. Is that it? So we then have so through the exchange there is but as I said, both parties have recognised the subject negates itself through the exchange of its labour, and the subject, which is receiving the labour, as it were, is able to negate itself as pure object by being a receiving subject. So through this dialectical movement, we're able to get past the problem of the sort of subject-object dualism, as it were. I think that's
correct. Thank you. That's very well put. Yeah. Was there anything else you wanted to?
No, I don't think so. I mean that what makes it equal is the notion of value. That value equalises the subject's position and the object's position. Perhaps if you could talk about how this relates to the Fichtean problem of knowledge.
Well, knowledge of Fichte is not. I mean, where do you think the question is in relation to Fichte?
I actually read that in this.
Okay.
In Maths. Let me find it. Yes, it says that insofar as the ego conquers nature, the ego knows it, but the nature remains resistant as an unknowable thing in itself.
And what Hegel does is he makes it known because nature becomes the product of nature itself becomes the product of humanity's labour. And that's how he transforms it. You might be familiar with a criticism that Marx makes of Hegel, I think in either the Rechts philosophy or Parisian manuscripts, where he says that Hegel never gets beyond abstract labour. But you see immediately from this section, and none of this was available to Marx, and Marx would not have known this, and certainly in the Rechts philosophy he doesn't get this detail about how work functions and how work exteriorizes. But you see immediately how he gets beyond the notion of abstract.
Why was Marx not able to have this? Was not
It was not. It just simply wasn't in the public domain. It first entered the public domain in 1931, as I explained. Yeah. I mean, you can see. I mean, a massive transformation both in Marx and Hegel studies became possible. If you think about it, from about 1925 to 1935. There was a huge wealth of material that came in, because the Parisian manuscripts were not published until 1957. But no, I mean, Marx would have, well, we know that Marx knew the logic, the phenomenology of spirit, and the Rechts philosophy. He would probably have known the encyclopedia as well. But that's the difference book he might have known, but I don't think it would have been seen as particularly important.
Would he not? So he wouldn't have known this section at all, because reading this, the idea that value balances things. What came to mind was the sort of imbalance of dialectical materialism, which is a Marxist idea, is it not? So
Hegel seems constantly to feel, I mean, if you. This is more obvious in the Rechts philosophy, but it's also in this text. Hegel's not worried about differences between subjects. He thinks that, or differences between families. He thinks that they will, over time, just balance themselves out. That there is a tendency towards the mean. And so he's got none of Marx's concern about the distinction between the contradictions that are inherent in accumulations of labour. Capital is nothing but accumulated labour, you remember the formula. He has none of that. He just thinks that these things will even themselves out, because there is a constant tendency towards the mean, which he actually says very late on in the Rechts philosophy.
Could I raise one point?
Yes,
very bit tangential, but I mean, which you alluded to, which was very interesting for me, when you said this talking about the God question. I mean, you're saying in there that if can God will tomorrow that 1 and 1 is 5, and you...
Let's stay out of the problems of medieval metaphysics. I think that might be...
Oh, okay. Yeah. Not on the metaphysics, but I mean, just purely applying the logic to it. I mean, how I would come to it is that this is a very fundamental thing, because I think the answer to this, for me, is clearly no. I mean, this is one of the things that, in a sense, fascinates one with these number systems, and again, perhaps going back to Plato, business that as a human construct, we cannot even see how any power from outside literally can alter these relations. I mean, this is something which I find very fascinating, and also at the same time interesting. The relations, the fundamental kinds of arithmetical relations. Now, this, however much we like to think it can be done, we cannot posit a way of doing it. So therefore, we have to take the position that no, it is something which, even if God has put it into place, it is there in place. Nothing can, so to speak, alter it. You can't conceive of how it can be altered. So this is the thought.
I'm not sure what you would want. I'd like to go back to the question of value. because I think that you have three thinkers who begin to think about Nietzsche, Marx, and Hegel, who all become extremely concerned with the notion of value, and it appears right here in this text. Labour produces value, but a value that then tends to equalize itself. As far as I don't know Fichte well, as far as I know, Fichte doesn't discuss value.
No. Sorry, yes, when I'm talking about I think it wasn't Fichte's dualist issue, an issue of knowledge. That we can only know the
Knowledge
object
and the ought.
and the ought.
If you remember the last session, I had said that what Hegel's concern was that for Fichte, the way that Fichte posits the notion of duty and the ought, that he therefore doesn't get beyond Rousseau's conception of negative freedom. And this will inevitably have the effect of producing, or the state will have to take over the job of policing negative freedom. And so he uses the word, he says that the consequence of both Fichte's and Rousseau's conceptions of freedom, or the subjective conception of freedom, is tyranny. Whereas he's going to, towards the end of this text, and then in the Rechts Philosophie, propose that because the state is something that we produce, at the same time, we do so freely. And so the state belongs to us in some sense, and we belong to it. There's a co-relation which is simply not present, because the state is part of not the way things ought to be, but the way things are in the way that we produce them. He doesn't go, for me, he doesn't, whereas there's a great deal one can say about Nietzsche's conception of value or Marx's, there isn't enough here, I don't think. Except that, the family becomes the place wherein the equalization of value takes place, because the undifferentiated, the indifferentness of the I to other selves is overcome in the family. And isn't that the point? And therefore, the value that's produced is not a stock that's held by an individual, but rather it becomes the possession of a family, the Besitz of the family. And the word he uses in the Rechts Philosophie is Vermögen, which is possessions, but also can be translated as capacity, but also as capital.
Who belongs to the family? Do the servants belong to the family?
No. I mean, the astonishing thing, I think, about this conception of the family is this is almost the family of the 1950s. This is the family of 2.4 children. This is a family which is constituted through the nuclear sexual relation.
The cousins are not in it?
They just don't get discussed. The wider family, the extended family, doesn't get discussed.
What's the problem about the servant-master relationship?
But that's the servant-master relationship is not raised here.
No.
I mean, that's a wider question of feudalism, I think, in the way that Hegel understands feudal relations to be coming to an end. They need to be overcome. But that's not here at all.
So the servant who's racing around family, looking after has got nothing to do with...
It could well be, but that might just be the work of a servant who's employed. But Hegel's not bothered about that.
I see.
This is a very restricted, it's often in the literature referred to as a bourgeois notion of family, or not?
Well, was he criticised at the time for this?
Not really, as far as I know. I mean, there's very little, not really. There's been oddly little discussion I mean, if you look at, certainly in the literature, there's very little discussion of Hegel's notion of the family.
You would have thought his students would have gone into this.
The student who did get into it, I think, is Karl Marx. And that's,
Yeah. Okay,
I think
thank you.
Engels' origin of the property of the family and the state is a critique of this, but it's also a product of it.
Yes, okay.
Actually, can you expand a bit more on that statement when you say indifference to the I is overcome in the family? What do you exactly mean?
Because he, in the state, what he calls the state of the natural state or the state of nature, every individual is indifferent to every other.
Yeah.
But in the family, that's not true.
Not true.
The labour of the one is that the product of that labour has to be shared within the family.
See,
Bye.
This big thing.
Yes,
Yeah. Yeah.
I think so.
I don't know if it makes sense.
No, I don't like it. Yes.
I've got one things mixed up there.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is, right.
A number of feminist critics have tried to rescue Hegel and argued that, for instance, it's not necessary that the differentiatedness of the subject roles within the family. Woman, you will see this in the Rechts philosophy. Woman is assigned to the hearth, man is assigned to civil society. Is a contingent, not a necessary distinction. But what I find the extremely strongly gendered nature of the division of the will, the notion of list, separating out into this Doppelsinn, the will, which has a masculine and a feminine principle. That, it seems to me, can't be got around. This is a highly, I have not myself understood until I began to work on this text, how highly gendered this division is. I don't think it is contingent for Hegel at all. It's quite necessary. I don't think, for instance, a number of feminist critics sympathetic to Hegel have wanted to posit that, a woman could be just as much a head of the family as a man. I think only a woman in man's clothing could be a head of a Hegelian family.
Is Hegel, he seems to be fairly dogmatic about the fact that in order for this dialectic to occur, there needs to be an equality of value for both the producer and the consumer. That the producer values his labour, and the consumer agrees with that value and consumes it at that value.
Where do you see that in this text?
In the English, it's on 123. On page 123,
Yeah.
first paragraph, value is what is universal, in brackets here. The movement as perceptible is the exchange.
Yeah.
So the value is universal, and its movement is exchange. But it strikes me, when it says value is universal, it means it's universal for both parties involved, both, I mean, we shouldn't say a thesis, not it's a theory. doesn't spirit require that there is this equality?
Die Bewegung des Dinges im Tausch ist I mean, I wonder if we're working just with slightly too Marxist notion of exchange here. This is a metaphysical exchange, isn't it, rather than a cash exchange.
But is it though? Because isn't the point about the exchange that it concretizes what would otherwise be an abstract label?
Yeah.
Because in your way of thinking, I think the cash exchange is, in a sense, you cannot assign a true value to it, can you? Because, say, like in the Higgsian sense, now Higgs said that value for him in economic terms, as I understand it, is that which is agreed between two individuals or two parties, in which case it is absolutely a floating notion. In other words, I mean, you might value that chair for 1,000, but maybe somebody else coming and doing an exchange might have some personal thing about the chair, might want much more. So therefore, I could see that point. That seems a very subtle point in Higgs, purely in economic terms. But when it comes to metaphysical thing,
It requires agreement, doesn't it?
Sorry?
It requires agreement.
Yeah, definitely.
Right. I'm just a bit tired, but I'm having trouble finding the German on the. I still. Value is what is universal. The movement as perceptible is the exchange. The same universality as mediation as conscious movement. Property is thus an immediate reckoning, mediated through being recognized. All that I have through work and exchange, i.e. in being recognized. I just can't at the moment find the German.
Would it be 2 paragraphs before, does he say alpha and beta?
Yeah.
I don't have the German.
It's very differently laid out
Okay.
in the English and the German. I still think this is an exchange. This is not an exchange in a strictly financial sense. The exchange is a consequence of recognition, not a consequence of going to the bank. I think.
But he does say earlier that the value itself is a thing, is money.
Yeah, I just don't think that he's bringing anything like Marx's precision to this. In both Kapital and in the Grundrisse, Marx uses actual calculations.
Yes.
He uses real figures. Hegel doesn't. Hegel's much more interested in what's going on behind it, I think. Would be my suggestion.
Could you expand on what is going on behind it then? Because I think I read it in perhaps quite a Marxist way.
Could you say, in this passage he mentions money, does he?
Yes. Are you reading English?
Yes, we're
on page 122, end of that top paragraph.
Oh, right, yes. Yes. Yeah.
Is it simply that it's rather than being an issue of financial exchange of product as such, it's more the confirmation of mutual self, mutual being.
Die Rückkehr zur Konkretion, dem Besitz, ist der Tausch. Das abstrakte Ding stellt im Tausche dar. The abstract thing is represented. I mean, my reading of this is that for Hegel, these are much more general remarks than you would find in Marx on the relationship between Geist and its concretions. As it were, that a family in accumulating property then reaches the point, because what he's doing is he's preparing us for how the family participates in civil society. So he's not really interested in the relative wealth or otherwise of families, but rather in a very abstract process by which the family acquires that which it can then use, accrue to itself and use to engage in the construction and the reconstruction or reproduction of civil society. That's how I read this. So it's very general, rather than for Marx, what something would be much more specified. In other words, he's describing a dialectical possibility, the emergence of dialectical possibility, or the emergence of one side of the dialectic. And the exchange, therefore, is, although it appears to be a financial exchange, it's really an exchange of dialectical meaning. And again, civil society can just remain at the level of itself, which would be merely reflective. But it's when it exceeds itself, and goes over and beyond itself, and it becomes more than simply the exchanging of exchange. That's the point at which the state is born. That's how I would read this particular passage.
And also, I think there was another point which you mentioned that in the did you mean that at all? I wondered whether in the long run you mentioned something like the families balances itself out or balances. Did you mention anything to that effect?
Well, inequalities, both within and in between families, have a tendency toward the mean.
Good.
A tendency towards the mean. He's not worried about one family being richer
than another, I see.
Is this related to his answer to Fichte and the problem of knowing the object? Because it seems to be a similar dialectical movement.
It's not directly related, I wouldn't have said. I mean, I think that the critique of Fichte is carried out somewhere else. It's indirectly related in that he is wanting constantly to show how what is positive is the absolute. In each of the dialectical relations that pertain, and in their resolution through Aufgehoben sein, through being sublated.
What does he mean then about the contingency of taking possession? Which is, after all,
Where is that?
on the final page, it's on the English, it's page 123, second paragraph. Here, the contingency in taking position is overcome.
Thank you.
I just wonder what the contingency is.
Isn't that explained at the bottom of the page in the footnote there? The bottom of page 123.
Ja, ich bin die Zufälligkeit des Besitzes meiner Geschicklichkeit. Neigung, Talent, bessere, näher gerückte Zufälligkeit. I think that's right.
So the contingency is the facility for productivity.
Yeah. Hier ist die Zufälligkeit des Besitzergreifens aufgehoben. Ich habe alles durch Arbeit und durch Tausch im Anerkanntsein. It's clearer in German actually. I have everything. It's not all that I have, but I have everything through work and through exchange and so in recognition, or in being recognized. Again, it's an extension. So we've moved beyond the extension, exactly as you said at the beginning. We have within the family, we're confronted by another subjectivity. But each family is itself also a person. And he's much clearer about this in the first of the system sketches. But when the two become one, when the husband and wife marry, they become a single person. And it's therefore in that way that they then confront, so that families. So whereas in the state of nature,
when you say person, I mean, how strict are you being in using that word?
well, I think what he has in mind is Roman law.
That's what I was thinking. So
I mean,
a bearer, so in other words, a bearer of an owner of property,
yeah,
is recognised as such.
As such, and in Roman law, a variety of entities or corporations or bodies can become persons. They might have a sort of a leading figure in them, the head of the family, the head of the corporation, and so forth, who represents that body. But they are, strictly speaking, a single person. So I think that's right.
But that kind of stresses that we're not talking about, when Hegel's talking about family, civil society, and the state, it's not necessarily a temporal sequence, because if the man and the wife become a person. I mean, personhood already implies, all the other things, civil society and the state. So,
yes, that's right. But there is a kind of a temporal assent here, but it's a temporal assent which doesn't build everything up from the ground every time, but rather presupposes where I'm positing myself within the hierarchy, as it where I come to recognition within the hierarchy of possibilities. So we're beginning with the pure self, and then the animal notion of the seeing, the perception. I mean, this is a demonstration rather than a temporal sequence. I think that's correct. Yeah.
This idea that when you mention the person, and for example, the company could be a person, but isn't that still a concept that's present today, isn't it?
Yeah.
In ethical. Now, is this where it started, or this idea that, for example, a company or an organisation is a person, did it start around about then?
Well, Hegel is simply, no, I don't think so. I don't think it's in Roman law. It's much more general. Hegel is radicalising it. So, for instance, he's quite critical of Kant. I don't know if I included the section where he's quite sharp about Kant's notion of marriage, where he says that a marriage is not a contract. The love relationship goes beyond the merely contractual. Now, this is that is a departure. From classical theory, where it most certainly is a contract. It's a contract with a particular, with a very specific and universal form. But Hegel says, no, this is a love relation.
Yes, on the page before, when he says that the more abstract his labour becomes, the more he himself is mere abstract activity, and consequently he is in a position to withdraw himself from labour and to substitute for his own activity that of external nature. Are you able to explain what that means?
Yeah. I take it that this is all the way through several of these texts. There is a reflection. A lot of this is very tentative. There is a concern with the ways in which industrialization is taking place. Hence, suddenly, he wants to deal with the question of the machinic. And so there are questions, I think, thrown up. And I think we have to read this paragraph as part of that. He's just trying to explain how the machine plays a role in this. He certainly was reading digests. It's not clear whether he read out of Smith directly or whether he had enough English to read out of Smith directly. But we know that he was certainly reading digests of Smith that were being and other British political economists that were being translated into German at the time. One of his pupils, I can't remember which one, was providing him with them. It's not Gans, it's the other people who makes additions to Rechts philosophy text, I think, if I remember right. I mean, I think this paragraph relates to the paragraph immediately before it. Where he's talking about in English, it's the top of page 121. This work is performed only to satisfy the need as abstractly, but the work becomes abstract as well. Each individual labours for a need. The content of his labour goes beyond his needs. He labours for the needs of many. Jede Befriedigung, also die Bedürfnisse vieler. Die Befriedigung seiner vielen besonderen Bedürfnisse ist die Arbeit vieler anderer. Da seine Arbeit diese abstrakter ist, so verhält er sich als abstraktes Ich. It's almost a detour, I think, of how labour, as it were, doesn't get sublated in the machine, but rather is almost pressed into being purely reflective.
Sort of proto-Marcusean.
Yeah,
but Marcuse essentially gets at the same thing.
Because he then moves among these diverse abstract process needs. A certain movement must now take place. I think effectively what he's doing is he's saying that the forms in which modern labour are expressing themselves don't fundamentally alter the movement which he's tracing. They may alter the particulars of it and the ways in which it's fulfilled, but then they don't alter the fundamental. I think that's how I read this. Zwischen diesen vielerlei abstrakten Bearbeiteten muss nun eine Bewegung stattfinden, wodurch sie wieder zum konkreten Bedürfnisse werden. And so we're brought back to the general. See, going back to that original point that you made, und diese Gleichheit im Dinge, which is translated here as equality, but it's not equality at all. The translation is misleading, because the German is Gleichheit, which is literally sameness. The sameness is in the recognition. You recognize it for such and I recognize it for such. It's not strictly speaking an equality, it's more like an equity. As its inner aspect. Als sein Inneres ist sein Wert. Now that makes sense to me. I think this translation's a bit vague, actually. It's misleading.
If you talk about that sort of 2/3 of the way down.
So this is 2/3 of the way down, 122,
Yes.
on page 207, the bottom of page 207. Ja, weil der andere seine Sache losschlagt, tue ich es. Und diese Gleichheit im Dinge, the sameness in the thing als sein Inneres, as it's das vollkommen meine Einstimmung und die Meinung. Which rather simply has its inner as in regard to which I concur entirely with the opinion of the other.
In the footnote, it seems to allude more to direct equality.
Yeah.
But it's the German is again the same with Gleichheit derselben, and the sameness. The equality of both parties is recognized. I don't think equality is right. Footnote, I mean, in the German, the footnote's it's half the length. There's a lot of explanation going on here. Now, the thing has its meaning. Of relating for another, being for another, existence is being recognized. That means it is the particular willing of another individual therein and sameness of the same. Gleichheit derselben. It means that this other with whom I exchange has become same to me, such that I can exchange with him. But there's nothing to do with equality. We have attained to the same value, such that we can then conduct an exchange. This is not equality. He's not equal to me. He has a sameness about him, which means he's become what I've become. Einheit absolut verschiedene. Unity. See, I mean, this is an exact parallel to the relationship of love. Und so dass für jeden der Willen des anderen ist, and so for each the willing of the other, and thus the willing of each is the willing of the other. In other words, we've become something identical. I think equality is too strong. We've become something identical such that we have a Gleichheit, a sameness, an identicality. But we've become identical to each other, but not equal. Equal suggests it has the wrong resonance. Yeah.
So the sameness is the roles in the exchange, the adopted roles in exchange. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the exchange is going to be on an equal footing.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Sorry, I'm not checking my email. I'm just looking something up. Yeah, the unity of the absolutely differentiated, Einheit absolut verschiedene. It's 25 to 2. We should stop. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.